In 2024, the European political landscape is at a crucial juncture, facing deep divisions and growing challenges. The rise of far-right populist movements across many EU member states signals increasing dissatisfaction with the European Union's handling of several key issues: immigration, economic inequality, and national sovereignty. At the heart of this discontent is a tension between the EU's supranational governance model and the nationalist sentiments that have gained ground in several countries. Will the EU deepen its integration to counteract these challenges, or will it see a rollback of powers in favor of national governments? To understand what lies ahead, we must explore the factors driving the rise of far-right movements, their vision for the EU, and how Europe is responding to this growing political force. The resurgence of far-right movements in Europe is not without precedent. Far-right ideologies in Europe have their roots in the early 20th century, most notably in the form of fascism in Italy and National Socialism in Germany. These ideologies, characterized by extreme nationalism, xenophobia, and anti-democratic tendencies, caused massive devastation during World War II. In the post-war period, the formation of the European Union aimed to ensure peace and cooperation, building a Europe based on shared democratic values. However, in recent years, far-right movements have re-emerged across Europe, capitalizing on economic, cultural, and political anxieties. The rise of these movements can be attributed to several key factors, including the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, the 2015 migration crisis, and increasing skepticism towards the EU's centralized governance. Several factors have contributed to the resurgence of far-right movements across Europe, each reinforcing the sense of disenfranchisement and distrust that many citizens feel towards their governments and the EU. The global financial crisis of 2008 had a profound effect on Europe, causing widespread unemployment, austerity measures, and rising inequality. The hardest-hit countries, such as Greece, Spain, and Italy, were subjected to harsh austerity measures imposed by the EU and the International Monetary Fund, IMF. These policies fueled discontent and provided far-right parties with an opportunity to position themselves as defenders of national sovereignty against EU-imposed economic hardships. The migration crisis of 2015 marked a turning point in European politics. Over 1 million refugees and migrants, fleeing conflict in the Middle East and North Africa, sought asylum in Europe, placing immense pressure on border countries like Greece and Italy. The crisis sparked public fears over national security, cultural integration, and the perceived strain on social services. Far-right parties across Europe capitalized on these concerns by promoting anti-immigration rhetoric and calling for stricter border controls. Far-right movements have tapped into anxieties over cultural change, particularly in relation to immigration and the growing presence of Muslim communities in Europe. These parties frame the influx of migrants as a threat to national identity and European values, advocating for policies that prioritize the cultural and religious traditions of the native population. This form of identity politics has resonated with voters who feel that their way of life is under threat. Open black lens bracket 9 source close black lens bracket. The rise of digital platforms has played a significant role in amplifying far-right messages. Social media has allowed far-right leaders to bypass traditional media outlets and speak directly to their supporters. These platforms have also become breeding grounds for disinformation and conspiracy theories, which often fuel the grievances that far-right parties capitalize on. The Great Replacement theory, which claims that native Europeans are being replaced by immigrants, has gained traction in several far-right circles. Far-right parties across Europe have gained significant political ground in recent years, each adapting their platforms to the specific concerns of their countries while maintaining common themes of nationalism, Euroscepticism, and anti-immigration policies. Marine Le Pen's National Rally, formerly the National Front, has become a major force in French politics. Le Pen has built her platform on opposition to immigration, the defense of French sovereignty, and the rejection of the EU's economic policies. She has called for a renegotiation of France's relationship with the EU, including the potential reintroduction of national borders and the return of certain powers to national governments. Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy party has risen rapidly to become the leading far-right force in Italian politics. Meloni's platform emphasizes the protection of Italian identity, opposition to immigration, and economic nationalism. She has criticized the EU for its handling of the migration crisis and called for greater autonomy from Brussels. Alternative for Germany, AfD, has become the leading far-right party in Germany, particularly in the eastern regions. The AfD advocates for a halt to immigration, particularly from Muslim-majority countries, and has called for Germany to reconsider its role in the Eurozone. The party has grown in strength since the 2015 migration crisis, positioning itself as a defender of German identity and sovereignty. Viktor Orbán's Fidesz party has transformed Hungary into what he describes as a liberal democracy. Orbán has consolidated power by weakening the judiciary, restricting media freedom, and passing laws that target immigrants. His government's refusal to comply with EU norms on democracy and the rule of law has led to ongoing conflicts with Brussels. The Law and Justice Party, PiS, led by Jaroslaw Kaczynski, has pursued an agenda similar to Hungary's Fidesz, focusing on judicial reforms that critics argue undermine democratic institutions. PiS has positioned itself as a defender of traditional Catholic values, opposition to immigration, and resistance to EU interference in Polish affairs. The European Union's policies and governance structure play a crucial role in shaping the political environment in which far-right movements operate. While the EU has implemented measures to counter the rise of IL liberalism, its policies, particularly on immigration and economic management, have also been criticized for fueling far-right rhetoric. The EU's immigration policies, particularly during the 2015 refugee crisis, became a focal point for far-right parties. The EU's attempts to impose mandatory quotas for refugee resettlement were met with fierce resistance from several member states, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe. Countries like Hungary and Poland rejected the quotas, framing them as an imposition on national sovereignty. The EU's handling of the 2008 financial crisis, particularly the imposition of austerity measures in southern Europe, has also contributed to the rise of far-right movements. In countries like Greece and Italy, citizens felt that the EU's economic policies prioritized the interests of wealthier northern European states, particularly Germany. This perception of economic injustice has provided fertile ground for far-right parties to gain support by promising to defend national economic interests. The EU has attempted to address democratic backsliding in member states like Hungary and Poland through legal mechanisms such as Article 7 of the Lisbon Treaty. Article 7 allows the EU to suspend certain rights of a member state if it is found to be in violation of fundamental EU values, including democracy and the rule of law. However, these efforts have been slow and, in many cases, ineffective due to the requirement for unanimous agreement among EU member states. Far-right parties are expected to make significant gains, particularly in countries like France, Italy, and Germany. These elections will provide a platform for far-right leaders to push for reforms that reduce the power of EU institutions and return more control to national governments. France. Marine Le Pen's National Rally is poised to make significant gains, with a platform focused on immigration, national sovereignty, and opposition to EU-imposed regulations. Italy. Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy and Matteo Salvini's Lega will dominate the far-right vote, with immigration and economic nationalism at the center of their campaigns. Germany. The AfD is expected to perform strongly in the eastern regions of Germany, where anti-immigrant sentiment is high. Hungary and Poland. Viktor Orbán's Fidesz and Poland's PiS will use their influence to resist EU efforts to impose democratic reforms. Far-right parties across the far-right's vision for the EU. Far-right parties across Europe share several overarching goals when it comes to their vision for the European Union. While there are variations in their approaches, they are unified by common themes of Euroscepticism, nationalism, and a desire to roll back certain aspects of EU governance. A core tenet of far-right ideology in Europe is the belief that the EU has become too powerful, infringing on the sovereignty of its member states. Far-right leaders argue that national governments should have more control over key policy areas, such as immigration, economic governance, and social issues. Many of these leaders have called for a renegotiation of EU treaties to repatriate powers from Brussels to national capitals. For example, Marine Le Pen's National Rally in France has advocated for a Europe of nations, where the EU's authority would be limited to issues like trade and defense, while national governments would have full control over their borders and economies. Italy's Giorgia Meloni shares this vision, calling for reforms that would give member states more autonomy while maintaining a loose economic alliance within the EU. Far-right parties generally oppose further EU enlargement, particularly the inclusion of countries outside Europe, such as Turkey. They argue that expanding the EU would dilute its cultural and political identity and place additional economic and social burdens on existing member states. For example, Orbán in Hungary has been particularly vocal about his opposition to Turkey's EU membership bid, arguing that the cultural and religious differences would be too great. (9 source close black lens bracket). Economic nationalism is a key pillar of far-right ideology. Parties like Italy's Brothers of Italy and France's National Rally have called for economic policies that prioritize the protection of national industries over the EU's single market rules. These parties argue that EU regulations are overly restrictive and hurt the competitiveness of national economies. They advocate for reducing the influence of EU fiscal rules, especially in countries that have been subjected to austerity measures. Perhaps the most unifying issue for far-right movements across Europe is opposition to the EU's immigration policies. Far-right leaders argue that the EU's open border policies, particularly the Schengen Agreement, have led to an influx of migrants that threatens the cultural and social fabric of Europe. They call for the suspension or reform of Schengen, a return to national border controls, and stricter immigration policies that prioritize native citizens over newcomers. In Hungary, Orbán has made the issue of immigration central to his government's agenda, framing his opposition to migration as a defense of Hungary's Christian identity. Similarly, Italy's Salvini has called for a naval blockade of the Mediterranean to prevent migrants from reaching European shores. The rise of far-right populism has triggered a strong response from centrist, left-wing, and pro-European political factions. These counterforces are working to defend the EU's core values of unity, democracy, and human rights, and to offer alternative solutions to the economic and social issues that far-right parties exploit. Mainstream political parties, including France's La République En Marche, and Germany's Christian Democratic Union, remain committed to the European project. They argue that the challenges facing Europe, rising inequality, migration, and climate change, can only be solved through deeper integration and cooperation. These parties promote reforms aimed at making the EU more democratic and responsive to citizens' concerns, while countering far-right claims that the EU is an overreaching bureaucratic machine. Youth movements and civil society organizations have emerged as powerful counterforces to far-right populism. Young Europeans, in particular, are more likely to support the EU in its values of multiculturalism, social justice, and climate action. Civil society organizations, including European Alternatives and Open Society Foundations, are actively working to promote media literacy, counter disinformation, and defend human rights. The European Commission and European Parliament have also taken proactive steps to counter the rise of far-right populism. Initiatives like the Rule of Law Report and Article 7 proceedings against Hungary and Poland are part of the EU's efforts to safeguard democratic values within its borders. Additionally, the EU has introduced programs aimed at addressing youth unemployment and regional inequalities, which are seen as key drivers of far-right support. The rise of far-right movements presents a fundamental challenge to the future of European integration. Several potential scenarios could unfold, each with significant implications for the EU's future. In this scenario, the EU successfully counters the rise of far-right movements through reforms that address citizens' concerns while strengthening European institutions. By addressing economic inequality, promoting social justice, and implementing more responsive immigration policies, the EU could regain the trust of disillusioned voters and reinforce the benefits of integration. Alternatively, the continued rise of far-right parties could lead to a fragmentation of the EU, with some member states pushing for a rollback of the EU powers or even withdrawal from the Union. This could result in a looser form of cooperation between states, where national sovereignty takes precedence over EU governance. A third possibility is a compromise between supranational governance and national sovereignty. In this scenario, the EU reforms its structures to allow member states more control over key policy areas while retaining core functions like the single market and customs union. This scenario could satisfy both pro-European and Eurosceptic voters. The rise of far-right movements in Europe has significant implications for the global political order. The EU is a major player in global trade, security, and diplomacy, and any shift towards nationalism and protectionism would have far-reaching consequences. Far-right parties are generally skeptical of NATO and favor a more independent European defense policy. A stronger far-right influence in Europe could strain relations with the United States, particularly on issues like defense spending, trade, and climate policy. Far-right parties' protectionist policies could undermine the EU's role as a champion of global free trade. If nationalist forces gain more influence, they could push for a rethinking of key trade agreements and a reduction in the EU's commitment to global cooperation on issues like climate change and human rights. Europe's far-right movements are part of a broader global trend towards authoritarianism and neoliberalism. The success of these movements could embolden similar forces in other regions, leading to a further erosion of democracy and human rights around the world. As Europe faces an uncertain future, the role of its citizens in shaping the direction of the European Union is more important than ever. The rise of far-right movements presents a formidable challenge to the EU's values of unity, democracy, and human rights. However, the strength of pro-European movements, youth activism, and civil society offers hope for a future where the EU can address its internal challenges while remaining a beacon of cooperation and shared values. Ultimately, the future of the EU will be determined by the choices of its citizens. In future, through their participation in elections, activism, and public discourse, European citizens have the power to shape the future of their continent and ensure that the EU remains a force for democracy, peace, and prosperity in a rapidly changing world.